So when we look at the accusations or the objections against Ellen White, they kind of fall, these are categories that I kind of came up with here. You have about 4 categories where when people approach Ellen White, they have these objections in their mind. So the first one is a theological objection, where, based on our interpretation of Scripture, we're kind of uneasy with talking about the gift of prophecy. It's manifested in the present day. I've mentioned to you about how evangelicals, the way they kind of interpret spiritual gifts, they kind of like to say, well, no, spiritual gifts were only for the first century church, and they're not ongoing today. It's kind of an easy way, an easy out, because the prophetic gift, the work of the Spirit, is a little messy and it's a little tricky. And so that's kind of an easy way out with that, taking that interpretation. Of course, if you would ask them, well, what about the spiritual gift of pastoring? Is that still available today? They'd be like, oh, yes, of course it is. Well, what about the spiritual gift of teaching? Is that still available? Oh, of course it is, right? So what about the spiritual gift of prophecy? No, that one's not. That one's not for today. It's not valid for today. It's kind of, like when we talk about the 10 Commandments. And so, you'll hear a lot of people say, no, the 10 Commandments nailed to the cross, the Sabbath, it's not binding on Christians today. And then you ask them, well, so is it okay to steal then? Is it okay to kill? Oh, no, of course not. Well, what about the Sabbath? No, that one that's the one that's not valid, but all the ones. Right, so there's a little bit of an inconsistency with that theology, right? But as Seventh-day Adventists, we believe that the gift of prophecy, the spiritual gifts, are still active in our world today. So that's the theological objections. There's some misunderstandings with that in their interpretation. The second one is the intellectual objections that we have to the manifestation of the gift of prophecy in our day today. And I think largely this is cultural. This is the Western mind, that we don't have much room in our Western mind, in our rational mind, for the supernatural. And so anytime we start talking about the work of the Spirit and supernatural things, it makes us a little bit uneasy. And not just when we talk about the gift of prophecy or the manifestation of the Spirit of God, but even when we start talking about praying and anointing and healing for the sick, that just makes us a little uncomfortable with that. And so, because of our Western minds, in fact, I had a professor, Dr. John Dibdahl, just an incredible man. He said that his observation, even among Seventh-day Adventists, he said, is that he feels that many of us are actually closeted atheists and agnostics. We say we believe, but then when it comes to actually believing, we're kind of like, I don't know, that makes me feel a little bit uncomfortable there. And so because of our intellectual objections, we're a little bit dismissive with the work of the Spirit. And so when we approach Ellen White, what we'll do is we'll say, well, she was hit in the head when she was a little girl. And so these visions and all these things, it was some type of a medical condition, some type of, what do they call that, epileptic seizures that she would, go into. And so now others on the positive side say, oh yeah, she was hit in the head, and that hit must have unlocked some type of superpower in her, that now she was able to, to be such a prolific writer or something like that. I wish someone could hit me in the head so to unlock some type of superpower. No, I'm just kidding. Please do not hit me in the head. Okay, right? Or so we become a little dismissive on the intellectual side. There was some medical issue going on there with her, or then that's when we realize that indeed she used literary sources. Then we say, see, that the gift of prophecy wasn't manifest there because she's borrowing from other individuals. She's a plagiarist. We'll talk about that. And then they may even say, well, see, look at some of the things that she says aren't true. And so I come back here to my Ellen White encyclopedia that I bought a few weeks ago. All right, it's an incredible resource. If you want to purchase that, I encourage you to do that. And there is a chapter here that is entitled 12 Controversial Statements on Ellen White. Now, I'll just go through this a little bit here. But did you know that Ellen White warns against wigs? I don't know if you know that or not, right? Wigs. And if you wear a wig, it could cause brain damage and even death. I don't know if you noticed that or not, all right? 12 controversial statements about Ellen White. See, and so the intellectual, objection would be like, that's ridiculous. Of course, wigs don't cause, brain damage and these kinds of things. Okay, she talks about toxic cosmetics. She talks about cheese. Let me see here. 12 controversial statements about Ellen White. Here's another one here. Let me see. Oh, yes, that you can get leprosy by eating pork. Who had ever heard about that? 12 controversial statements about Ellen White. Here's another one about this antediluvians and giant fossils. Here's another one about amalgamation between man and beast. Here is another one. Let me see here. Parents, maybe you want to close the ears of your children just for a little bit. And I don't know why people like to, they really just, I don't know if you've noticed the objections, they really like to get in on this one here, what Ellen White has to say about masturbation. All right? And so we approach this from an intellectual level and we say, see, the things that she says are not true. So that's the intellectual objection here. And then there's a third objection to Ellen White, and that is the emotional objections to her. When we hear the spirit of prophecy, a prophet, that just feels weird, doesn't it? It just sounds weird, doesn't it? If we were to say that out, in our community, that is just a weird statement. So that now this is more based on emotion. It just doesn't feel right. It feels a little weird. Now, sometimes those who at one point were her most ardent supporters, all in, and we spoke about that wonderful world of Ellen White, right, where she's perfect and everything she wrote is perfect. Sometimes it's her most ardent supporters who, when they realize that things aren't the way that they thought they were, then they'll go to that other extreme and just completely reject her. Again, they feel they've been taken advantage of, right? They feel they've been deceived. And so it's an emotional response. And then finally, you have that experiential objection to Ellen White. And I would call these are individuals who Ellen White, when they were growing up, was presented as a sledgehammer. Ellen White says. Ellen White says. You can't do this because Ellen White says, and Ellen White says, and Ellen White says. And that was their experience. And so now that they're older, they're adults, and they hear Ellen White, they're like, I don't really want to have anything to do with her. So see, these are some of the categories of objections from and accusations against Ellen White. What we have been focusing in our sermon series together has been maybe more of the theological, intellectual objections. We spoke in our last sermon about the importance of being familiar with how God speaks to individuals, avoiding those unrealistic expectations. The perfect prophet, everything she ever wrote was perfect, inerrant, infallible, original. Everything she wrote was unique, received strictly only by divine revelation from God, that she's exhaustive in her interpretation of Scripture, divine commentator, the final word, fully authoritative in all matters. Right? We've spoken about this at length, that this is that unrealistic expectations that we have. But what we've learned from Hebrews chapter 11 and chapter 1, Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 1, is that when God speaks to individuals, he does it in many and various ways through the prophets. You see, in our mind, we have this idea that everything, again, I think this is part of the challenge, that everything is through that direct divine revelation, so that the light comes from the throne of God, puts us in a trance, and then the person just starts writing just straight. That's not how it works. The Bible tells us here in Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 1 that there are many and various ways by which God speaks through the prophets and through the gift of prophecy. And so we highlighted some of those ways are in the Bible. Now, not all of these ways are used equally or as frequently. It seems that God uses some ways more than other ways, but we spoke about, for example, face-to-face. This was something special, how God spoke to Moses. Very few people would have that face-to-face encounter with the Lord. Then there's dreams and visions, and God says he speaks to people through dreams and visions. This is where we found out about Marian in Exodus chapter 15, that the Bible calls Marian a prophet. But then we learned in Numbers chapter 12 that though Marian was called a prophet, she wasn't perfect. She made mistakes. So here is unrealistic expectation number one, that prophets are perfect. They're not. We see that in Marian. There's another scenario where we think that prophets never say the wrong thing, or they never write the wrong thing. And so you have a story in the Old Testament where David approaches the prophet Nathan, and David says, I have a plan, and I'm going to build a temple for the Lord, and I have all this material. And Nathan tells David, that's wonderful, that's amazing, the Lord is with you, God bless you. And then Nathan walks out of the palace, And then the word of the Lord comes to Nathan and it says, turn back around and tell David, no, that he's not going to build a temple for me. Do you see that here? Well, what's going on with Nathan? Is he a flip-flop? Is he a false prophet? He said one thing and now he's contradicting himself. What's going on there? So we have these biblical examples of that prophets are not infallible. They're not perfect. They're not inerrant. We looked at the Spirit of the Lord, when the Spirit of the Lord comes upon individuals and the charismata is manifested upon individuals. And then we have the Word of the Lord, which in my view, it seems to me that this is the primary way, the Word of the Lord, the primary way with which the Lord communicates to people, that is through His Word. That is, God gives a message to the individual. And then that individual has a responsibility to share that message with others. Now, when we look at it that way, to a certain extent, hasn't God given all of us a message to share with the world? Isn't that right? You know, and so we'll explore that a little bit here, a little bit more, a little bit later here. But that is in essence how the Lord will communicate with people. He'll give them a message. And then he asks the individual to share that message with others. And so once the individual has this encounter with the Lord, and they are then tasked with the responsibility of conveying and sharing that message with others. We've seen in the Bible that they do it in various ways and in many ways. So we've seen individuals in the Bible will act out the message of the Lord in some form of drama or visual presentation. Others will write down the message that God has given to them. And we've highlighted Daniel, the prophet Daniel, John, David, Paul. They would write things down. Sometimes those who received the message from the Lord would employ scribes in writing that message down, or secretaries that employ secretaries to write that message down. Still others would research the material. In fact, I have another passage here which I think is interesting. We'll come to it here a little bit. Others will research the material. For example, you have Luke, and we have no indication that Luke ever received any kind of divine revelation straight from God to write down the Gospel of Luke. In fact, he tells us the way he wrote it was he took Matthew, he took Mark, what had already been written. He did some interviews, probably with people who were still alive, who had seen Jesus, who had been there. So from reading Matthew, from reading Mark, from reading these other sources, from interviewing other people, he then puts together, through the guidance of the Holy Spirit, a gospel which is unique to him. In fact, the book of Acts, again, we have no evidence to suggest, again, that Luke received any divine revelation direct from the throne of God to write the book of Acts. The book of Acts seems to be, it was his journal, it was his diary, it was events that he had gone through, and through the Spirit of the Lord, he wrote this down for us. And so as the individuals are writing this down, they will research the material. They will draw from other sources. We mentioned that, the gospel writers, right? Luke draws from Matthew and Mark. Matthew draws from Mark. We understand that he received the gospel, again, not through some type of divine revelation coming straight from the throne of God, but he received the gospel through Peter's memory, through what Peter shared with him. So these are all the multiple ways that individuals seek to share the message that God has given to them. The message is not always original to them either. Again, going back to the book of Luke, it's not original to him. He draws from Matthew. He draws from Mark. Originality is not a sign of inspiration. The sign of inspiration is the message and the content that they share with others. And then some, like you see here, John the Baptist, they don't write anything down. The word of the Lord comes to them, and they don't write anything down. Again, with John the Baptist, we know very little about John the Baptist. His ministry lasted, it was very short amount of time that his ministry lasted. We know that he said, "Behold the Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world." When he saw Jesus, he had a message to the Pharisees, right? He called them vipers and a few other things, and talked about, hellfire and some other things. He was baptizing people. Let me see here. He also said he baptized Jesus, and he said about Jesus, he must increase, I must decrease. We know that John asked Jesus through his disciples if he's the one that should come or is it somebody else. And then we know he was arrested and he was beheaded, and that's all we know about John the Baptist. And yet when you ask Jesus about John the Baptist, Jesus says that of anyone that was ever born, John the Baptist is the greatest. And so we have this manifestation of individuals who receive the word of the Lord in the Old Testament, in the New Testament church. They never wrote anything down. We don't even know what their message was, but we know that the gift of prophecy manifested in their life. And so, how does all this apply to Ellen White? And when we say that we believe that the gift of prophecy was manifested in her life. So first of all, I want us to notice what she says about herself. And some people are startled by this statement. They were startled in her day, and sometimes they're startled in our day as well. She writes, "I do not claim to be a prophetess. Others have called me a prophetess, but I have never assumed that title. I have not felt that it was my duty thus to designate myself. In fact, those who boldly assume that they are prophets in this our day are often a reproach to the cause of Christ." So if you think about her times in the 1800s and when she's living, and she's very well aware of who is claiming to be a prophet in her day. And she clearly says it. She says those who assume that they are prophets and they're proclaiming that they're prophets, they're a reproach to the cause of Christ. How does she regard herself? How does she view herself? "I view myself as a messenger, entrusted by the Lord with messages for his people." It's really important here because remember what happened in the wonderful world of Ellen White is that we began to claim more for her than she even claimed for herself. And I find this interesting, and I highlighted this already. She's a messenger entrusted by the Lord with a message for his people. And we kind of highlighted that God has given all of us a message to share to the world around us, the gospel message. In fact, every time that you'll see the gift of prophecy appear, or the spiritual gifts appear in the New Testament, for example in Ephesians chapter 4, where it appears, you have a prophet. And a prophet is defined as someone who receives a message from the Lord to share with others. And then right next to the spiritual gift of prophecy, you have the spiritual gift of pastor. And what is a pastor defined as? Someone who has received a message from the Lord to share with other people. And then right next to the pastor, you see the spiritual gift of evangelist. And what does an evangelist do? He shares the message of God that he has given to him with other people. And then in Ephesians 4, you have the spiritual gift of teaching. And what is a teacher? A teacher is one who has received a message from the Lord to share with other people. Do you see? Now maybe they do it in their own unique ways. And maybe they have perhaps a different level of authority when they speak. But in essence, it is that same function of sharing the message that God has shared with them with other people. And so the main way that Ellen White communicated was writing the message that God had shared with her. And yes, Ellen White had help. Her husband was one of the first ones to help her write out the messages that God had given to her. So her husband, James White, would help her with grammar, would help her with editing what she wanted to write. She always felt she had a third-grade education, and she always felt that she had a lack, that she wished she was better in writing than what she was. And so she would have her husband help her with the grammar, help her with editing. Later on, Ellen White was able to employ secretaries who would also help her with her writing. Eventually, she could employ an entire staff that would help her with her writings. And as we've looked at the biblical examples, that's what we see in the Bible as well. Individuals, having secretaries or having help. It's not out of this world. Yes, Ellen White would have multiple drafts of her letters and of her books that she was writing. That is a very normal and natural process that all of us engage in when we are writing something. We have multiple drafts. She's living in a time that facilitated having help and having multiple drafts. Paper was fairly easy to achieve, easy to have a hold of. Pens and the writing process was different than in biblical times when you're writing on a piece of leather or on a papyrus, and you can't make mistakes. And so yes, she had multiple drafts of her writing. She had help in putting her messages together. But from what we see in the Bible, it is not outside of what the Bible has shared with us. This is another example. 1 Thessalonians chapter 1 and verse 1. Notice what it says as the Apostle Paul is writing this epistle to the church in Thessalonica. Paul, and who else? Silas, and who else? Timothy, to the church of the Thessalonians. Paul even had help as he's crafting this letter to the Thessalonians. They are co-laborers working together. Paul and Silas and Timothy, they're working together. And so the message that is being shared in 1 Thessalonians, even in 2 Thessalonians, is not strictly Paul's message. It is a message that also comes from Silas. It is a message that also calls from Timothy. He had help. Here's another one. 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 12. Peter says, it's with the help of who? Silas, that I have written to you. Even in the Bible, we see that they had help. It wasn't just them by themselves. Now, again, this is only a problem if you hold to that unrealistic expectation that everything someone receives, a prophet receives, is solely through direct revelation. Again, just straight from the throne of God, a light, and then they just start writing. That's not what the Bible shares with us. And so this is what we see Ellen White employing here, having help. Now, part of the process of Ellen White conveying the message that God had shared with her wasn't only having help, editorial help or secretarial help or help with grammar and syntax and multiple drafts. Part of the process didn't only involve that, but part of the process also involved using literary sources, drawing from other sources. And here is where the accusation is made. See, she's a fake because she's a plagiarist and she's borrowing. Again, this is only a problem if you, again, hold to that unrealistic idea that everything comes through divine revelation and they go into a trance and they start writing. But that's not what we see in the Bible. It's not what we see in her ministry. Now, when we talk about using literary sources and borrowing and drawing from other sources, is that there is a continuum of borrowing or of drawing from different sources. And I apologize because it may be a little bit small. It may be a little bit small to read there. So what is plagiarism? On the far, what is that for you? The far left? The far left, I have the word theft. I have a column on there, theft. What is plagiarism? Plagiarism is taking credit for someone else's work. Either wholesale copying the individual's work and passing it on as your own work, or maybe even large portions of somebody's work and taking credit as your own work, where not only are you taking credit for it, but it is even impacting monetary gains of the original author and or opportunities that individual has that you're stealing from them. That's all the way on the left. It's theft, taking credit for another's work. That is what plagiarism is. But then you have other columns, a continuum of what it means to take and borrow sources from other individuals. So you have the informal column there. The informal column, there's you make use of common knowledge. You're not taking credit for another person's work. Documentation is not really required in informal writing. What does informal writing look like? Jokes, stories, anecdotes, observations about life, general knowledge. Informal would be something like if I said, have you guys noticed that Seventh-day Adventists tend to be a little bit stuffy and stiff and legalistic? Do I need documentation for that? How would you even go about documenting something like that, right? This is just some kind of general observation that I've made, that sometimes some churches are a little stiff, they're a little stuffy, some church members are legalistic, right? But how do you go about proving something like that, right? Not necessary, it's just an observation of life, it's informal, it's a conversation, it's something that we've just said. All right, no documentation necessarily needed on that one. Now, there's another column when we're talking about borrowing sources, and that is popular works and popular material. When you're writing popular literature or popular things, occasional documentation, you'll find occasional documentation to enhance the credibility of what you're trying to say, but it's not a matter of obligation, since the purpose of popular writing is not to prove, but it's to entertain. And so you'll have sources like fiction that fall into popular writings, or popular books, New York Times bestsellers, or whatever, there's all kinds of books out there. These are popular writings, fiction, children's books. They can put a little bit of documentation in there, but it's not really necessary. We'll read the book anyways, and we'll enjoy the book anyways. But now you keep moving further to the right. So you have theft, plagiarism on the far left, then informal, then popular, then serious writing or serious presentations. And these are writings that are reliable and are influential. These are writings that you would depend on. They're not academic. We're not all the way on the right yet, but they are reliable. The purpose of this serious writing is to persuade, is to convince, is to convert, it's to help people. An example of this serious writing, I should say. How many of you have heard of John Maxwell and his laws of leadership, right? Okay, that would be considered, serious writing. It's not academic writing. In fact, when I was working on my doctorate, and one of the aspects of our doctorate was leadership, and our professor said, do not quote and cite from John Maxwell in your dissertation. John Maxwell is not academic. He is serious writing. It's something that you can use at your church. It's something that's for a small group. You'll be benefited by it. In fact, you'll probably be benefited more by his work than if you try to take academic leadership writing to your church, right? But John Maxwell is not academic, so don't quote from him. Not saying it's not helpful, but don't quote from it, okay? It's helpful, but it's not academic, all right? That would be an example of serious writing. Hopefully, another example of serious writing would be sermons. Hopefully, right? My sermons are reliable. Now, I don't need to document my sermons per se. Now, if you ask me, you're like, Pastor, where'd you get that? I can share that with you because, I do my homework on this, right? But I had a professor at seminary who said every single sermon should have footnotes and should have a bibliography at the end. All right, I think that's a little bit too much, but it is serious. Hopefully, my sermons are reliable and influential, but documentation is still not necessary. And then you have religious writings and you have devotional writings. And Ellen White's writings actually fall into this category of serious writing. It's not academic, but it's not popular and formal either. Documentation is helpful, but it's not necessary. And then finally, on that far right, you have academic writing. And those of you who have gone through academic writing, you know that there's even a scale within academic writing. You have levels to academic writing. You have the undergrad level, where you can cite, one or two things in, your 2 to 3 page paper, and it doesn't matter that the sources are from 1950. It's okay, or whatever it is, right? That's okay for undergrad. When you get to graduate school and you start working on your doctorate, and the level for citations and for formal documentation increases from your master's level to your doctorate level. And then you have to make sure you put the things in direct quotes, right, if you're quoting directly, and then you give your citation. And they have different formats for that as well that you can use. I was always worried when I was writing my dissertation. I was like, I got to be careful, because if you even use 3 words in a row, I don't know if this is an exaggeration, right? If you even use 3 words in a row that are, someone puts in a Google search and they come up in somebody else's document, you'll be accused of, plagiarism. So I was always nervous about that, making sure that, everything is documented properly. So you have direct quotes, you have paraphrases that you still have to give a citation to in the paraphrase. Then if you have a little bit more that you want to cite, then you use block quotes for that. Sometimes you want to replicate a graph or a chart from someone else. And at that point, then you have to ask for express permission. In my dissertation, I had to do that. There's a few charts that I wanted to reproduce, and so I had to contact the publishers. I had to contact them for express written permission to use that. Then you put that in the appendix, right? I mean, this gets complicated in academic writing. And then it's the amount of quotes that you're putting in, and the quality of the sources, and the quality of the quotes, and the dates, and the relevancy, and the credibility, anyways, it gets complicated on the academic scene, if you guys can kind of get that right. Ellen White's writings, they fall under serious writing, religious writing, documentation not necessarily required, but helpful if you do it. Yes, Ellen White borrowed, but she borrowed no more than any of us borrow today when we have a document that we want to write. Are you following me here, Newport Richie? No more than what we have to do. In fact, going back to my dissertation, if I had not cited one individual in my dissertation, what do you think my professors would have said? Wait, you're making this stuff up. Wait, where's your evidence? Isn't that funny how we have this double standard? Right? If Ellen White uses sources to document her stuff, we hold it against her. But if I don't have documentation, to support my things, then I'm making stuff up. It's funny how we have this double standard, right? About things. And you have to remember, yes, she borrowed, but no more than any of us borrow. And you have to remember, writing standards in the 1800s were different than they are today. Copyright laws were different in her days than they are today. But as things changed, even in her lifetime, as writing standards were changing, copyright laws were changing, she would make changes in her writing as well and would begin to cite sources. And so you see that one of the last books that she wrote, The Great Controversy, 1911, and it is just filled with citation after citation after citation. And she says, I drew from these historical sources to create something new, which is actually what we all do when we do academic writing. My dissertation, right? We're citing from different sources. We're not wholesale copying, but what we're trying to do is craft and make a unique contribution as we're citing these sources. That is what she was doing back in her day. She's not wholesale copying other people's work and claiming credit for it. She's creating her own unique message, and that is the point. And this is only problematic for individuals who believe everything is divine revelation. They go into a trance and then they start writing. That's not what the Bible shares with us. It's not the model that we see. All right, now here's some of the more specific issues that came up. And this was in that Veltman study that lasted for 8 years, where they took random sampling from 15 chapters to see how much exactly she was borrowing and she was using. And so they said, at the result of this study committee, they noted that 31% of her sentences showed some type of dependency. Now I want to clarify that, because when we see that initially, 31% of sentences, what we initially conclude is 31% of her writings show some type of literary dependence. But it's not 31%, it's not a third of her writings. It's a third of sentences. Now, this is where it gets a little, I think, nitty and splitting of hairs here. But some have looked in, some statisticians, and that's not my thing, but statisticians have looked at this. If 31% of sentences showed some type of dependency, and they gave a scale of the type of dependency that these sentences showed, and they had 7 levels. I just put up 5 up there. Is this strict verbatim that she should have put in quotation marks and then, gave a citation afterwards, which again, remember, writing standards were different in her days. So is the sentence showing strict verbatim? Or is it just verbatim? Or is it a paraphrase? And even the paraphrase, and they start breaking it down, is it a strict paraphrase? Is it a simple paraphrase? Is it a loose paraphrase? The 6th category is that is she citing from Bible passages? And the 7th category is does there show no dependency on other sources? And so when they look at this, the statisticians have said that it could be as low, when you look at the sentence, and it could be just one word. It could just be one word. It could be 2 words. This gets really, like I said, splitting of hairs, really complicated how you come in and you look at this and approach this. But statisticians have said that when you look at that evidence, her literary borrowing could amount to as low as 3% of her writing, or as much as 10% of her writing. Which, to me, it's not problematic how much of the writing is 3 or 10%, because, again, this is only a problem if you believe that divine revelation, go into a trance, and they start writing right away. What she was doing as she was writing is what we do today when we write as well, except that writing standards and copyright laws were different back then. But the point is, what is the message? What is her unique contribution? Here's another accusation that was made against her, and that has to do with originality. We shared with you last week from the Ellen White Encyclopedia over there that there was a Jackson Sanatorium, and the person who ran the Jackson Sanatorium, he had 10 laws for health, and he said that we need to drink plenty of water, breathe fresh air, that we need to exercise, that we need to eat well, and, et cetera, all the 10 of them. Sounds familiar, doesn't it, right? And so we start saying, well, that's what Ellen White says. You see, Ellen White, what she was saying was not unique. Other people in her day also believed it. Again, first of all, uniqueness, originality is not a sign of inspiration. Like Luke, what she wrote was not original to her. What God was doing in giving her a message about health, and I'm specifically using that message there of the health reform, is that what God is doing is he is revealing to her a framework of health reform. In fact, when you look at that first vision that she writes, and you can find it in the book Spiritual Gifts, Volume 4, under a chapter entitled Health. I was just reading it here over these last few weeks here. When she presents that message that God had revealed to her about health, what she's doing is she's speaking in general terms about health. She's drawing from Bible principles. She's saying, in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, they were vegetarian, right? And then she'll go in the days of Moses. Now Moses gives laws about what's clean and what's unclean. And so she draws these, Bible principles, drawing Bible principles, and then she starts saying, you need to eat healthy. But she doesn't specifically say how to eat and what, your diet needs to be. She says, eat healthy. She says, don't smoke. Don't use tobacco. Don't drink. And she goes on to expound on the 8 laws of health. I was just reading this morning. She says, open your windows. It gets too stuffy in your house. Let fresh air inside your house. I wish we had some windows here in the church that we could open up, right? Let some fresh air in. Those are the kinds of things that she's saying. Let the sunlight in. Don't have a dark house, right? I mean, these are general principles. So what God is doing is he's pointing her in the age and in the culture and in the time that she's living in. God is pointing her in the right direction. Are you following me? He's pointing her in the right direction. And if you remember the sermon that I preached about the 1800s and medical science in the 1800s, she's living in a time when medical knowledge was fairly low, where doctors were prescribing bloodletting, when doctors were prescribing mercury as a cure, when doctors were prescribing arsenic and strychnine as a medicine to get better. So she's writing in this time, and God is pointing her in the right direction. And for the most part, what she has written about health, it's held up. It's pretty good. It's held up pretty good. It's aged well. Some of the things maybe haven't aged as well. Some of the things that she says about cheese and the way cheese was produced back in the day, or she speaks about sickly cows. We have some regulations now that help with those things. Maybe they didn't age well. Cheese? Pun intended. Okay, all right. Maybe some of the things didn't age well, but cheese is still a high-fat food. It's still a high-sodium food. And so if you're looking to lose weight, you probably want to avoid, cheese because of its nutritional values. Some of the things haven't aged well, like what she said about bicycles, maybe what she said about wigs and cosmetics. Maybe they haven't aged well, but I believe that the majority has. And for the rest of those statements that just don't seem to make sense to us, what we then do is we use our reason. We use her historical context. We use our culture. We use our knowledge base to help make sense of things for us today. All right, so number 1, her dependency. Number 2, it's not unique. Here's number 3, her historical inaccuracies and or discrepancies that are found in some of her writings. Don't miss the forest for the trees on this one. Okay? So there's a historical event. This is one of the ones that gets the most criticism. There's a historical event that she writes about in the book The Great Controversy. I think it has to do with Huss and Jerome. And she writes chronologically that event took place before another event, but now we know that no, that event did take place, but it didn't happen before that event, it happened after another event. Are you following me here? Okay. It happened at a different time. Don't miss the forest for the trees. In the Bible, we sometimes have things that are out of chronological order or are in a different order. Both in the Old Testament, in the stories of Samuel, the Kings, the Chronicles, sometimes they're in different orders. In the Gospels, sometimes things are in a different order. The point isn't the chronology. The point is what happened. Are you following me? The point is the message, so don't miss the forest for the trees. We have other, I hate to call them inaccuracies in the Bibles or discrepancies. But Moses, as he's writing about what animals you should eat and what animals you shouldn't eat, and he gets to the section about birds and fowls that you should eat and fowls that you shouldn't eat, in that section of fowls that you shouldn't eat, he throws in bats. Did you know that? Bats. Bats are not birds. I don't know if you caught that or not. So what's going on, Moses? You're being scientifically inaccurate here, right? Are you guys following this? Don't miss the forest for the trees. He says of animals that chew the cud that you can't eat, he says don't eat the rabbit. Well, the rabbit doesn't chew the cud. It moves its mouth like this, but it doesn't chew the cud. What's going on, Moses? You're being unscientific here. All right. Again, don't miss the message. Don't miss the forest for the trees. Okay, now that's it. Now, Newport Richie, that's it. But I do have something else. Will you indulge me a few more minutes? Can you give me a few more minutes? Can you? Okay, all right. So I wanted to highlight, these were the three main ones, right? The plagiarism, she's drawing from other sources, that it's not unique to her, so, it can't be from divine revelation. And then the inaccuracies. Those were the big three that I wanted to highlight. But I wanted to share a little bit more, just a little bit. If you will humor me, if you will indulge me, a little bit more about what she has to say about her own writings. All right, we'll go through this quickly, but I think this is helpful because I'm not going to preach a fourth sermon on this. Okay, here goes. This is Ellen White about her writings being inspired. So she's writing to an individual, and she's responding to an individual, and she says, in your letter, you speak of your early training to have implicit faith in the testimonies, and you say, and now she's going to quote from his letter that he wrote to her. It says, you say, I was led to conclude and most firmly believe that every word that you ever spoke in public or private, that every letter you wrote under any and all circumstances was as inspired as the Ten Commandments. That's a little preview to the wonderful world of Ellen White. I think that's what we were doing with Ellen White during those years, but this is in her time. The individual is saying that. Everything you ever wrote, public, private, every word that comes out of your mouth, unrealistic expectation. All right, here it goes. And she says, you have studied my writings diligently, and you have never found that I have made any such claims. Neither will you find that the pioneers in our cause ever made such claims. Again, this is claiming too much, claiming more for her than what she ever claimed and what our pioneers ever claimed for her. Here's another one. She says, there are times, and if you want to read more about this, Selected Messages Volume 1 and Selected Messages Volume 3, they're entire sections that are dedicated to this. So Selected Messages Volume 1 and Selected Messages Volume 3. She says, there are times when common thoughts must occupy the mind. Common letters must be written. Such words, such information are not given under the special inspiration of the Spirit of God. Here's another one. In regard to infallibility, the myth, perfect, infallible, inerrant. In regard to infallibility, I never claimed it. God alone is infallible. Here's another one where she has individuals who would take her writings to say things, and she says, as people take my writings to say things that I've never said. Notice how she responds to this here. People that are taking her writings to say things that she never said, that she never intended. She says, some will gather up the very strongest statements, and they will drive these things. All right, so they take those strong statements. Sometimes you got to speak, strongly. They'll take those strong statements, she says, and then they'll drive them because they want to use the whip and have something to drive. Did you catch that? Select the Messages, Volume 3, right? And she says, and then they take my statements, they misuse my statements, and they start saying things that I've never said, and they're driving these things. This is the myth that Ellen White was an absolutist, unwavering, unyielding, line in the sand, here I stand, I will not have any pepper or ketchup or mustard on my table, so help me God. Now, if you're an Adventist, right? You know about that, right? You know about what she says about salt and pepper and cinnamon and all these other kinds of things. And so they take these statements and they drive them because they say they want to use the whip and have something to drive. I think that actually says more about the individual who is doing the driving, who's doing the whipping, rather than her writing. Ellen White was not this absolutist, unwavering, unyielding individual. Ellen White will actually call those individuals fanatics and extremists. And so A.G. Daniels, one of our former General Conference presidents, in that 1919 Bible conference, he will relate a story of a missionary, an Adventist missionary, in the early 1900s who traveled to the country of Sweden. And I'm not sure if Sweden is up in the Arctic, but the missionary was really far up north. We'll call him Brother John. So Brother John goes to be a missionary in Sweden in the early 1900s, way up north, where it's cold. And I think the only thing that was available to eat was like fish. I don't want to call it seal meat. I don't know what they eat up there, right? But again, 1900s, prior to, refrigeration, prior to being able to get, Publix wasn't around the corner for him. I mean, he's out in the middle of nowhere, northern Sweden, and the only thing that was available for him to eat were meat products. But he was like, no, I will not eat meat. Because Ellen White says, right, not a morsel, or whatever, I'm paraphrasing here, not a morsel of flesh food, right, in your mouth. And so he's there for several months, and A.G. Daniels goes to visit him up in Sweden after several months. And then A.G. Daniels sees him, and the individual is gaunt. He's cadaverous. He's emaciated. And he looks at him, and he's pale, and he's thin. And he looks at him, and A.G. Daniels, and he says, Brother John, what have you been nourishing yourself on? And he says, a lot of water and a lot of north wind. And A.G. Daniel turns to him and says, you're going to kill yourself. And he said, no, but Ellen White says, no, you're going to kill yourself for no reason at all. Either you're going to kill yourself or I'm going to have to pull you out of the mission field. Here, and he gives them a bowl of chicken soup. Eat this and get your nutrition back up. What is going on with you here? A.G. Daniels goes back to the United States and has a conversation with Ellen White and tells her about this experience of this gentleman, that because she wrote, right, not a morsel, flesh meat, nothing in your mouth. And so A.G. Daniels tells the story to Ellen White, and A.G. Daniels says that Ellen White responded, and she said, why don't people have any common sense? Isn't that interesting? And I can share more stories with you, right? But it's about time, it's about place, it's about context, it's about culture, it's about reason. All right, now this is going to be the last quote here that I share with you all. And I think this is actually a beautiful, graceful quote from Ellen White. This actually comes from two different places. I think it's Testimonies, Volume 1, and then I believe it's Testimonies, Volume 5, I'm not sure. But she writes about this, and she says, look at this one here. Regarding people who have objections to her writings, who, it's just kind of weird, they just can't take it in. She says, there's some who believe in the testimonies, and they have erred by urging them unduly upon others. The testimony would be the work of Ellen White. And she says they've erred. They are unduly urging this upon others. And then she mentions a specific place, and she says, there are some of God's children who doubted the visions, and they were skeptical about my ministry and about the manifestation of the Spirit of God. And she says, and they had sufficient cause to make them so. You see, Ellen White was understanding about it. She understands it. She gets it. You start talking about prophecy, you start talking about prophets. She gets that it's weird. And she says, these are good people, children of God, but they had doubts about the ministry, and they had sufficient cause to make them so, and it's okay. Have you ever met an Adventist that doesn't, right? Doesn't really, Ellen White, they just kind of don't get along too well, right? Have you ever met an Adventist like that? Ellen White's okay with that. Notice what she says. Such should not be deprived of the benefits and the privileges of the church. Isn't that interesting? I find it interesting, especially because as Adventists, we turned Ellen White into a fundamental statement of belief. I think she would be uncomfortable with that. She says there's some people who don't believe it, they're skeptical. She's all right with that. She says, don't deprive them of the benefits and the privileges of the church. She says such individuals should not be set aside. Isn't that interesting? Sometimes it seems we're a little more zealous for Ellen White than even Ellen White was zealous for herself. Isn't that fascinating? All right, Newport Richie. So this is the point. Don't quench the spirit. Don't despise prophecies. Test all things, prove all things, hold fast that which is good. I believe in the spiritual gift of prophecy. I believe that the gift of prophecy was manifested in the life and ministry of Ellen White. The church, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, also believes that this was a gift that was manifested in her ministry. I've looked at the evidence against it, and I just highlighted 3, but I've looked at the evidence against it. It doesn't convince me. Is she inerrant? No. Is she infallible? No. We can go down the list of unrealistic expectations. Do her writings carry authority? Yes. Are her writings insightful? Yes. Is there a blessing if you'll read her writings? Yes. And so I encourage you, Newport Richie, reacquaint yourselves with this amazing woman and with her writings. And I believe that as you do so, individually you will be blessed, and our church will be blessed as well.